June 25, 2009. Michael Jackson dies. The world mourns. Tributes pour in. Vigils are held. And the media declares him a legend, the king of pop. One of the greatest entertainers who ever lived. But behind the tributes, behind the grief, there is a financial reality that shocks everyone who learns about it. Michael Jackson, at the time of his death, was not a wealthy man. He was not even solvent. He was drowning in debt. Approximately $500 million in debt. His assets were mortgaged, his properties were in foreclosure, his income had not covered his expenses in years, and the estate he left behind was not a fortune. It was a financial disaster. The question is not just how this happened. The question is how someone who earned over $1 billion during his career could die $500 million in debt. How does the most successful entertainer in history end up broke? The answer is a story about spending, mismanagement, legal fees, bad investments, and a lifestyle that required millions of dollars a year to sustain. It is a story about what happens when income stops, but expenses do not. And it is a story that reveals the fragility of fame. Because Michael Jackson was not poor, he owned valuable assets, his music catalog, his image rights, his brand, but those assets were leveraged, borrowed against, and when he died, the debts were due, and the estate had to scramble to save it from collapse. Michael Jackson's financial troubles did not begin in 2009. They began decades earlier. In the 1980s, Jackson was at the peak of his career. Thriller, released in 1982, became the best-selling album of all time. He was earning tens of millions of dollars a year from album sales, tours, endorsements, and merchandising. He was one of the wealthiest entertainers in the world, but even then his spending was extraordinary. In 1988, he purchased Neverland Ranch for $19.5 million. He spent an additional $35 million transforming it into a private amusement park and zoo. He employed over 150 staff members at the ranch: gardeners, zookeepers, security, cooks. The annual operating cost of Neverland was estimated at $10 million. Just to maintain it, not to improve it, not to expand it, just to keep it running. Jackson also spent lavishly on other things: art, antiques, costumes, jewelry. He bought statues, paintings. He commissioned custom furniture. He collected memorabilia, and he shopped. Constantly. Friends and employees later described shopping trips where Jackson would buy hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of items in a single afternoon. Clothing, gifts, books, toys. He did not budget. He did not limit himself. He spent as if the money would never run out, and for a while it did not. Because he was earning so much. But earning and keeping are not the same thing, and Jackson was not keeping. In the 1990s, Jackson's income began to decline. He released fewer albums: History in 1995, Blood on the Dance Floor in 1997, Invincible in 2001. None of them matched the commercial success of Thriller or Bad. He did not tour as frequently. And when he did, the tours were expensive to produce and did not always generate the profit expected. The 1993 allegations damaged his reputation. Sponsors distanced themselves. Endorsement deals dried up. And the settlement, reportedly between $15 and $23 million, was a significant financial hit. But the spending did not stop. Neverland still cost $10 million a year. Jackson still employed a large staff. He still shopped. He still bought. And the gap between income and expenses widened. To cover the gap, Jackson began borrowing. He took out loans, using his assets as collateral. His most valuable asset was his music catalog. Not his own music, but the ATV catalog, a collection of music publishing rights that included over 200 Beatles songs. Jackson had purchased the catalog in 1985 for $47.5 million. By the 1990s, it was worth hundreds of millions, and Jackson used it as collateral for loans. He borrowed against it, repeatedly. By the early 2000s, he had borrowed over $200 million against the catalog. The loans had high interest rates, and they required regular payments. Payments that Jackson, with his declining income, struggled to make. In 1995, Jackson merged the ATV catalog with Sony's music publishing division. The new entity, Sony/ATV, was a 50-50 partnership. Jackson owned half. Sony owned half. The deal provided Jackson with an infusion of cash, but it also meant that he no longer had full control over the catalog. He could not sell it without Sony's approval, and he could not borrow against his share without restrictions. The partnership was financially beneficial in the short term. It gave Jackson liquidity, but in the long term, it limited his options, and as his financial problems worsened, those limitations became critical. By the early 2000s, Jackson's financial situation was dire. He was spending approximately $30 million a year. His income was a fraction of that. He was defaulting on loans. Creditors were threatening foreclosure. Neverland Ranch, which he had mortgaged multiple times, was on the verge of being seized, and Jackson, despite being one of the most famous people in the world, was essentially broke. He had assets, but he had no cash, and he had enormous debt. The 2005 trial made things worse. The legal fees were astronomical. Jackson's defense team, led by Thomas Messereau, cost millions. The trial lasted 5 months, and during that time, Jackson earned nothing. He was not recording, he was not performing, he was in court, and when the trial ended, even though he was acquitted, he was financially devastated. He could not return to Neverland, he could not work. He was physically and emotionally destroyed, and the bills kept coming. In 2006, Jackson faced foreclosure on Neverland. He owed millions in unpaid loans. The property was scheduled for auction. At the last minute, a financial firm called Fortress Investments stepped in. They purchased the note, they restructured the debt, and Jackson retained partial ownership. But the rescue came at a cost. Jackson no longer fully owned Neverland, and he was still responsible for debt payments he could not afford. By 2008, he had effectively abandoned the property. He was living in rented homes, moving frequently, and his financial situation was spiraling. In 2009, Jackson agreed to the This Is It tour. It was, in many ways, a last-ditch effort to solve his financial problems. The tour was scheduled for 50 shows in London. EG Live, the promoter, projected that Jackson could earn over $100 million, enough to pay off his debts, to stabilize his finances, to give him a fresh start. But Jackson was not physically or mentally capable of performing 50 shows. He was not healthy. He was not ready. And on June 25, 2009, he died. The tour never happened, and the financial problems he had been trying to solve remained. When Jackson died, his estate was in chaos. The executors, John Branca and John McClane, were appointed to manage it. And what they found was shocking. Jackson owed approximately $500 million. The debts included loans against the Sony/ATV catalog, loans against Neverland, unpaid legal fees, unpaid staff salaries, unpaid property taxes. The estate's liquid assets were minimal. There was almost no cash. And the creditors were circling: foreclosure, lawsuits, liens. The estate was on the verge of collapse. But the executors had one advantage. Michael Jackson's death, tragic as it was, created a surge in revenue. His music sales skyrocketed. This Is It, the documentary made from rehearsal footage, grossed over $260 million. Merchandise sales boomed, and the value of Jackson's brand, his image, his music, increased dramatically. The executors used this revenue to stabilize the estate. They paid off the most urgent debts. They renegotiated loans. They restructured the estate's finances. And slowly they began to turn it around. By 2016, the estate had paid off the majority of the debt. They had generated over $2 billion in revenue since Jackson's death. Through music sales, through the This Is It film, through the Cirque du Soleil shows, through licensing deals, the estate became one of the highest-earning posthumous estates in history, and the financial crisis that existed in 2009 was, by most measures, resolved. But the question remains, how did it get that bad in the first place? The answer is multifaceted. First, Jackson's spending was unsustainable. $30 million a year in expenses requires consistent, high-level income. And Jackson, after the peak of his career, was not generating that income. Second, Jackson was poorly advised. He trusted people who mismanaged his finances, who made bad investments, who failed to control his spending. Third, Jackson's legal troubles cost him tens of millions of dollars. The 1993 settlement, the 2005 trial, the various lawsuits over the years, all of it drained his resources. And fourth, Jackson used debt as a financial tool. He borrowed against his assets. And when his income declined, he could not service those debts. But there is another factor. Jackson's refusal to accept financial reality. He continued to live as if he were at the peak of his career. He continued to spend, to employ large staffs, to maintain properties he could not afford. He did not downsize, he did not cut expenses, he did not adjust. And that refusal, that inability or unwillingness to live within his means, contributed significantly to his financial collapse. The story of Michael Jackson's debt is not unique. Many celebrities have faced similar problems. High income followed by high spending, followed by declining income, followed by debt, followed by crisis. What makes Jackson's case notable is the scale. $500 million in debt, for someone who had earned over $1 billion. It is a staggering disparity, and it reveals the dangers of lifestyle inflation, of spending based on peak earnings, of assuming the money will always be there. Jackson's estate in the years since his death has been extraordinarily successful. The executors have managed it well, they have monetized his legacy, they have paid off debts, they have generated profit, and they have ensured that Jackson's children are financially secure. But that success came after his death. During his life, Jackson was trapped. Trapped by debt, by bad decisions, by a lifestyle he could not afford but could not give up. The financial crisis also raises questions about the people around Jackson. Where were his financial advisors? Where were his accountants? Where were the people who should have been saying no? Who should have been controlling spending? Who should have been managing the debt? The answer is that some of them were there. Some of them did raise alarms. But Jackson ultimately made his own decisions. He fired advisors who tried to limit his spending. He surrounded himself with people who enabled him. And he refused to confront the reality of his financial situation. There is also the question of exploitation. Jackson in his final years was vulnerable. He was desperate for money, and people took advantage. Promoters who pushed him into tours he was not ready for. Advisors who charged exorbitant fees. Hangers-on who encouraged spending. The system around Jackson was not designed to protect him. It was designed to extract value from him. And when he died, that system collapsed. But the damage was already done. The estate's recovery is impressive. But it does not erase the fact that Michael Jackson died in financial ruin. That he spent the last years of his life under immense financial pressure. That he was unable to enjoy his wealth because it was all leveraged, all owed to someone else. And that the stress of that financial situation contributed to the circumstances that led to his death. The This Is It tour was not just a comeback, it was a financial necessity. Jackson needed the money. He needed to pay his debts. And that need, that desperation, played a role in the decisions that led to June 25th, 2009. The story of Michael Jackson's debt is a cautionary tale about spending, about trust, about the dangers of leveraging assets, and about the fragility of financial security. Jackson was, at one point, one of the wealthiest entertainers in the world. But wealth is not just about assets. It is about liquidity, about cash flow, about the ability to meet obligations. And Jackson, despite his assets, did not have that. He had debt, he had expenses, and he had no way to cover them. The estate's success after his death is bittersweet, because it shows what could have been if Jackson had lived, if the tour had happened, if he had generated the revenue the estate later generated. He could have paid off his debts, he could have stabilized, he could have lived comfortably, but he did not live. And the financial pressure he was under, the desperation to make the tour work, contributed to the environment in which he died. The question of how Michael Jackson ended up $500 million in debt is not just about numbers. It is about decisions, about priorities, about the way fame distorts financial reality. Jackson lived in a world where normal rules did not apply, where he could spend millions and believe it did not matter, where he could borrow against the future and assume the future would always be there, but the future was not always there. And when it arrived, it brought debt and pressure and crisis, and ultimately it brought death. If you made it this far, you understand something important, that wealth is fragile, that debt is dangerous, and that even the most successful people can end up broke. Michael Jackson earned over $1 billion, and he died owing half a billion. That is not just a financial failure, it is a systemic failure, a failure of the people around him, a failure of the industry that profited from him, and a failure of a system that allowed someone that famous, that talented, that successful to fall that far. Drop a comment, share your thoughts, and if this made you see Michael Jackson's story differently, pass it along. Because stories like this matter, they remind us that money is not wealth, that assets are not security, and that without proper management, without discipline, without people who will say no, even $1 billion can disappear and leave nothing but debt.